Welcome to Never Forget, the part of my channel where I talk about remarkable games that really stuck with me over the years, and let's face it, my way of paying tribute to my favorite games of all time. So after 2 episodes covering Jedi Knight 2 Jedi Outcast as well as Ys Origin, I think it's time to delve into my personal top 3. Or, well, okay, rather top 2, because the third is Dark Souls and the world doesn't need more videos than that. But going to my second favorite, in this video I present to you a gem called Guild Wars. Guild Wars 1 for me has one of, if not the most ballsy yet genius overall game designs I have ever seen. What we have here is an MMORPG that first came out in April 2005, with 3 other expansions later on. One of its contestants at the time was obviously World of Warcraft, which initially released in November 2004, but unlike World of Warcraft, Guild Wars never featured a monthly subscription fee and always successfully did its own thing on the side. And I loved it to death for that. You see, by doing its own thing on the side, what I mean is Guild Wars had a few core elements that you wouldn't see in most other MMORPGs. From the beginning, for example, this game very clearly focuses on small-scale team skirmishes, and everything was designed around that. Instead of having an open world, every area was created as an instance, only for you and your 4 to 8 man party, which made team play an important factor immediately. And to match the player's party, the PvE monsters too had selected spells that mirrored the playable classes and always ran around in carefully designed unit combinations. So basically you never had to deal with any monotonous one-on-one experience that most other MMORPGs call a leveling process. The reason why this focus on team play worked so well is because this game has one of the deepest character building systems I have ever seen in a multiplayer game. Try to picture this. First you pick a class and distribute your points in 4 to 5 different attributes. Then you pick one of the other classes as a secondary from which you benefit another 3 to 4 attributes. Then you open the skills menu and realize that a single attribute already contains a staggering amount of skills and synergies between them, and thanks to your main and secondary classes you now get to combine skills from 7 to 8 different attributes for just one build. And after you've gone through all that, you can even start working on entire group builds for you and your mates. So essentially the same process times 4 to 12. One great thing ArenaNet did here was to limit the skills you can have equipped at a time to a maximum amount of 8. And that limitation was what drove people to really optimize the builds they wanted to play and be creative with them. My favorite experience, for example, was when I played a ranger build that used an ability called choking gas, which applied a buff to my attacks that interrupted all enemy spellcasting in an AoE. Starting out from just choking gas, I could then add a bunch of other skills, like a cooldown reduction that made it possible to have choking gas up at all times, a stance from the warrior class that let me attack more often, a bunch of extra interrupting abilities in case my main skill got cancelled, and some utility spells. And believe me, coming up with your own builds or optimizing them your own way and then having successful runs in the different PvP modes is one hell of a power trip. Now, moving on to another design aspect, guess what most other MMOs have, but Guild Wars didn't. I'll give you a hint. It's grinding. The level cap in Guild Wars was 20, which you usually reached shortly after finishing just the tutorial area, and items worked in a similar fashion, where weapons and armors you found came close to hitting the highest possible stats very early on. So it was relatively easy to bring your character close to the general power limit. I mean, there were still some ways to min-max your stats, which especially for PvE characters could be fairly expensive, but not only were those increases nowhere near as dramatic as in other MMOs, you were also allowed at any point to instantly create max level PvP only characters with access to all skills and items you already unlocked, either in PvE or with PvP currency. All of this created a bunch of advantages for the players. Since high level equipment was easily attainable, focus was on personal skill and build optimization, not having better stats than your opponent. Also, you didn't have to grind for an eternity to get a shot at the endgame content, and playing playing PvP only was just as valuable as playing PvE, despite the PvE content being superb in its own right, really. And at this point you might wonder why I'd call the PvE content superb if there wasn't even anything to grind and keep you motivated, right? Well, Guild Wars very much did have grinding for crafting materials and rare weapons and armor sets, but guess what? Even the rarest items didn't have better stats, only more exotic skins, so all the rewards for grinding were cosmetic. Of course, looking at Dota 2 or Overwatch, cosmetic item rewards like that are very popular today. But may I remind you that Guild Wars basically did the same thing nearly a decade earlier and without microtransactions and charging actual money? And it worked out too. All the farmers were more than happy with grinding materials and running the PvE endgame just to show off their rare weapons and armor skins in PvP arenas, and everyone who didn't feel like grinding still got to play all modes without being at any gameplay disadvantage whatsoever. Especially considering the direct competition to World of Warcraft, what kind of balls does it take to focus all efforts on designing deep game mechanics and saying to the player, you know what? We respect your intelligence enough that we believe you're going to get hooked by all these systems and game modes, not because you want to farm the same content over and over for higher numbers. But hey, if you want to farm, go ahead. Just realize how uncompetitive it would be to equate time spent grinding with gameplay advantages. That's why I love this game so much, and that's why its sequel, ignoring so many of these wonderful design aspects to become more like World of Warcraft, pains me to no end. And so far I've only talked about the major gameplay systems. I haven't even gotten into how fantastic, for example, the presentation was. The art direction alone had such distinct styles for every expansion, going from somewhat classic fantasy to Far East Asian, then African/Egyptian, and finally a Nordic setting. And man, some of these areas were positively fucking inspired, like a petrified forest or a toxic desert, or what is probably my favorite area in any video game ever, a sea turned into solid jade, where you'd see shit like crystallized tidal waves, giant sea creatures frozen in plain sight, and huge jade mining operations in the middle of what used to be an ocean and is now just gemstone as far as the eye can see. And of course these areas weren't empty either. There was a ton of PvE content here, and lots of PvP modes too actually, ranging from casual 4vs4 arenas to competitive 8vs8 guild battles and even higher player counts, and they all shared these beautiful tile sets. Of course, almost no game is perfect, and Guild Wars is no exception. However, I only had two significant grievances. For one, the Eye of the North expansion being a huge drop in quality, and the PvP having some balancing issues as well as a somewhat rigid metagame in some modes. But then again, Eye of the North was the last expansion before Guild Wars 2, so clearly we were already on the way out, and with a game as complex as this, it's actually a wonder Guild Wars didn't have more balancing problems if you ask me. The bottom line I want to end on is this. Guild Wars wasn't just a great game. Obviously I haven't played everything that ever existed, and maybe there were or are comparable ones I'm not aware of, but when I look at what online games are these days, even the good ones, and then look at what Guild Wars offered back in the day, the richness of content, the complexity, the competitiveness, the art direction, the atmosphere, and most importantly the complete lack of necessary grinding, monthly fees and microtransactions, then I can't help but feel that I might never get a game like it ever again. And a lot of developers should study just how deep and pro-consumer it actually was. Guild Wars, rest in the knowledge that at least in my mind you will always be the definitive online RPG. Bouken, signing out.